So the range is the simplest measure of variability. It is simply taking the maximum observed score and subtracting the minimum observed score from that value. So if you look at our example here, the highest number is an 8 and the lowest number is a 1. So that means our range is 7. So it's 8 minus 1. And what I want you to think about is, well, why is the range considered a poor measure of variability? So if you think about it for a minute, it only takes into account two scores, two values. So it doesn't factor in any of the other scores. You might have 1,000 scores, it only takes into account two of them. So it's probably not going to be a very good representation of all the distribution of scores around the mean, median, or mode. The standard deviation is a much better measure of variability because it factors in all the scores and it looks at the average distance those scores are from the mean. So typically when we talk about variability, we focus on standard deviations. So I'm going to walk you through an example of standard deviations. I won't ask you to actually calculate this, but I want you to kind of get a sense of how it determines the average distance the scores are around the mean. So I'm going to use a very simple example. So we have 6 values or 6 scores here, 2, 2, 4, 4, and 3, 3. So the first step in the process is to calculate the mean. So obviously the mean of those numbers is 3. The second step is to subtract the mean from each of the values. So for the first value of 2, it's 2 minus 3. That gives you a value of negative 1. Again, 2 minus 3 for the next one is also negative 1, and so on. When you add them up, if you did it correctly, you should get a sum of 0. Okay? That's just kind of a sign that you're on the right track. The next step is to calculate what's called the sum of squares. So you take all of the values that you just calculated, the negative 1, negative 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, and you square them. Because you need to get rid of the negative sign. So you square all those values. So now that negative 1 becomes a 1, right? And then so now you square all the values. Now you want to get the sum of those squares, which is why it's called sum of squares. You take the sum of, so you square all these values, then you add them up. So as you see, we got 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0. If you add them up, which is again the sum, you get 4. So our sum of squares for this particular example is 4. Then we divide our sum of squares, which again is 4, by the number of values that we have. And we have 6 values. So if we take 4, we divide it by 6, we get a score of 0.66. And just for reference sake, this is our variance. And we'll talk about variance in a second. So our variance for this particular example is 6.66. Now, variance is the average squared distance our scores are from the mean. Now remember, we had to square all of our values to get rid of the negative signs. So this variance is the average squared distance our scores are from the mean. The problem with variance is that we've squared it, so now we're in a different unit of measurement, so it's not necessarily that helpful anymore. But I want you to recognize that variance is the standard deviation squared. And variance, the symbol is s squared. So now let's get to the standard deviation. So standard deviation essentially is the variance, the square root of the variance. Right? So we know our variance, again, is 0.66. Now to get us back to our original unit of measurement, we have to do the square root, right? Because we squared earlier, so now we have to square root. Take the square root of 0.66, and that gives us 0.81. And 0.81 is our standard deviation, which again is the average distance our values are from the mean. Now, again, I won't make you calculate standard deviations, but I do want you to know what they are. So, things I want you to remember or what to know, I want you to know how to create frequency distributions, bar graphs, histograms. I want you to be able to calculate central tendency. So in other words, be able to calculate the mean, median, and mode, and know when to use each type of measure of central tendency. And then I also want you to be familiar with the different measures of variability. So understand what the range is, what variance is, and what standard deviations are.